it was a great movie, but it seemed like there was resistance to that movie.
Mel Gibson was on the Joe Rogan podcast talking about the sequel to The Passion of the Christ.
What if one of the most attacked films of the modern era was carrying something far deeper than controversy? What if the real story was never just about box office numbers, religious debate, or Hollywood outrage? When Mel Gibson sat down with Joe Rogan, the conversation seemed ordinary at first. Filmmaking, faith, the industry, the price of telling uncomfortable stories. But then Gibson began talking about what really happened behind the Passion of the Christ. And the tone changed. Joe Rogan, someone who has spoken with world leaders, fighters, scientists, comedians, and whistleblowers, suddenly looked different. Quieter. More focused. Almost shaken. Because this did not sound like a director promoting a movie. It sounded like a man describing a battle. A battle against an industry that wanted the project to disappear. A battle against pain, pressure, and public attack. And maybe something even harder to explain. Because once you understand what was happening behind the camera, the Passion of the Christ becomes something much larger than a film. It becomes a story about sacrifice. Not just the sacrifice on screen, but the sacrifice required to make it. And once you see that, you may never look at the movie the same way again. The story Hollywood did not want told. To understand why Gibson's revelations hit so hard, you have to go back to the beginning. The Passion of the Christ was never designed to be a comfortable biblical drama. Gibson did not want a polished studio epic. He did not want soft lighting and safe emotions. He did not want a version of the crucifixion that audiences could watch from a distance. He wanted the opposite. Something brutal. Something intimate. Something that forced people to feel the weight of what they had only heard about in sermons, paintings, and scripture readings. For Gibson, the point was not simply that Jesus suffered. The point was why. During the conversation with Rogan, Gibson explained that the film was built on one central idea, that Christ's sacrifice was not only a historical event. It was personal. It belonged to every human being. It reached across time and pressed itself onto every viewer sitting in the dark. The responsibility was not placed on one crowd, one empire, one generation, or one group. It was placed on humanity. That is why the film feels so direct. It does not let the audience hide. Gibson spent years studying the gospel accounts of the final hours of Jesus' life. But he was not only interested in listing events. He wanted to capture the spiritual force beneath those events. The fear. The betrayal. The cosmic pressure. The terrible beauty of a sacrifice that Christians believe changed the destiny of the world. That is why the film opens in the Garden of Gethsemane. Not with armies. Not with speeches. Not with spectacle. But with a man alone in darkness. Jesus kneels in prayer while the disciples sleep nearby, unable to stay awake in the most important hour of their lives. The night feels heavy. The silence feels alive. The suffering has already begun before a single whip is raised. Then Satan appears. Not as a monster roaring in the open, but as a voice in the shadows. A whisper. A suggestion. A slow poison of doubt. And then the serpent comes. Jesus crushes it under his foot. It is not just a dramatic image. It is a direct echo of Genesis, the first promise that evil would one day be defeated. In that moment, Gibson tells the audience exactly what kind of film this is going to be. Every frame matters. Every shadow has purpose. Every gesture carries meaning. Every image is meant to connect suffering on earth with a war being fought beyond what the eye can see. This was not made to be background entertainment. It was made to confront. To pull the viewer forward. To make them ask whether what happened 2,000 years ago still has something to say to them now. And that is exactly why the resistance began. The resistance behind the camera. During the Rogan interview, Gibson pointed to something many people in the entertainment world rarely say out loud. There was a double standard. Stories about different religious traditions could be treated with care, nuance, and respect. They could be framed as meaningful, culturally important, and worthy of serious attention. But Christian stories, especially traditional Christian stories, were often met with a different energy. Dismissal. Mockery. suspicion, sometimes open hostility. Gibson described an environment where Christianity was treated as the one faith system people felt allowed to attack without consequence. That mattered. Because The Passion of the Christ was not a vague spiritual story. It was not an abstract meditation on belief. It was explicitly Christian. Explicitly Catholic in much of its imagination. Explicitly centered on suffering, sin, redemption, and the cross. And Hollywood did not know what to do with that. Studios that should have been interested in a project from an Academy Award-winning filmmaker suddenly became hesitant. Meetings cooled. Support disappeared. People who had once stood beside Gibson became distant. The message was clear. This was not the kind of story they wanted him to tell. But Gibson did not treat the film as a career move. He treated it as a mission. That difference changed everything. When traditional support collapsed, he put his own money behind the film. He took the risk himself. He gathered people willing to follow the vision even when the industry around them seemed to be warning them not to. And what came out of that pressure stunned Hollywood. The Passion of the Christ became one of the highest-grossing R-rated films ever made. That success was more than financial. It exposed something. Executives had insisted audiences did not want this kind of film. They believed viewers were too modern, too secular, too detached, too uncomfortable with serious Christian storytelling. But millions of people showed up. Not for comfort. For intensity. For conviction. For a movie that refused to apologize for believing its subject mattered. And that was only the public battle. Because according to Gibson, the making of the film carried another layer entirely. A layer that the cast and crew never forgot. The events no one could fully explain. The production of The Passion of the Christ was anything but ordinary. At least not according to those who experienced it firsthand. Gibson told Rogan about incidents during filming that still sound nearly unbelievable. Moments where the boundary between normal filmmaking and something far stranger seemed to fade. Jim Caviezel, who portrayed Jesus, did not simply perform suffering. He lived through it. The cross he carried was not a lightweight prop. It was heavy, real, and exhausting. During production, Caviezel's shoulder was dislocated. In the scourging scene, he was accidentally struck by actual whips. The pain was not imagined. It was not completely acting. It was real. And that reality is visible on screen. The fatigue in his body. The shock of each blow. The shaking weakness. The way suffering appears to pass through him instead of around him. Then came the lightning. Assistant director John Michelini was reportedly struck twice while working on the movie. Caviezel himself was also reportedly struck during the crucifixion scene and somehow survived without the severe injuries most people would expect. For a film focused on divine judgment, sacrifice, and the meeting point between heaven and earth, those events became difficult for the crew to dismiss. Maybe they were coincidences. Maybe it was simply the weather. Maybe they were the kinds of stories that develop around demanding productions. But for those who were there, the atmosphere shifted. Lightning carries powerful biblical symbolism. It often appears alongside revelation, authority, fear, and the presence of God. So when it repeatedly appeared around a film about the crucifixion, people began wondering if something larger than a movie was taking place. And the unusual stories did not end with physical danger. There were personal transformations. Luca Leonello, who played Judas Iscariot, reportedly began the production as an atheist. By the time filming wrapped, he had become a believer. Months spent immersed in a story of betrayal, guilt, despair, mercy, and redemption had transformed him at a profound level. Maya Morgenstern, who played Mary, was secretly pregnant during filming. In a story so deeply surrounded by death, her hidden pregnancy became a quiet symbol of life. Sorrow and birth. Crucifixion and renewal. A mother holding her dying son while the actress herself carried new life within her. Gibson also spoke about reported healings connected to the production. A young girl with severe epilepsy was said to have gone an entire month without seizures after being present during filming. Others were said to have experienced restored senses. Were these miracles? Coincidences? Psychological reactions to an intense spiritual environment? People can debate. But many members of the crew left with the feeling that they had been part of something they could not completely explain. And that feeling is part of why the film still carries such impact. It does not feel manufactured. It feels lived through. The film that divided everyone. When The Passion of the Christ finally reached theaters, the reaction was immediate. And it was divided. Some people were overwhelmed. Others were offended. Some called it a masterpiece. Others saw it as dangerous, excessive, or deeply troubling. Almost nobody treated it as just another movie. Roger Ebert, one of the most influential critics in American cinema, gave the film 4 stars. He described it as one of the most violent and intense films he had ever seen, and said Gibson's portrayal helped him understand the suffering of Christ in a way he had not before. That reaction mattered because Ebert was not known for giving easy praise. He could celebrate a film, but he could also dismantle one. And yet here, he recognized the power of what Gibson had made. But praise was only one side of the response. The film also drew serious criticism, especially before its release. Some religious leaders and scholars worried that certain portrayals could revive old anti-Jewish stereotypes that had historically been used to justify persecution. Those concerns were not trivial. The Passion narrative has a painful history. For centuries, distorted interpretations of Christ's death were weaponized against Jewish communities. So any major retelling of those final hours was always going to carry enormous responsibility. Gibson argued that his intent was not to blame one group. His point was collective responsibility. All humanity stood implicated in the crucifixion. The film was about sin, sacrifice, and redemption, not ethnic accusation. Still, the debate revealed how explosive this story remains. Because the crucifixion is not a neutral subject. It sits at the center of Christian faith. It touches history, theology, violence, guilt, and salvation. It cannot be retold without awakening old wounds and new questions. Scholars also noted that Gibson included material not directly found in the Bible, such as Judas being tormented by demonic children. But Gibson was not trying to make a documentary reconstruction. He was creating a theological vision. A cinematic meditation on spiritual warfare. The film uses symbol, nightmare, visual metaphor, and sacred art to show not only what happened physically, but what Gibson believed was happening spiritually. That is why the movie walks such a narrow line. It is historical drama. It is religious art. It is horror. It is prayer. It is accusation. It is invitation. Different viewers entered the theater with different expectations, and they left with completely different experiences. Some were spiritually moved. Some were angry. Some were changed. Some were disturbed. But the controversy only made the film larger. People who might never have watched a biblical movie went to see what the argument was about. Churches organized group screenings. Pastors preached about it. News outlets dissected it. Commentators argued over its meaning. Gibson had created the rarest kind of film. One that could not be ignored. The Resurrection Project. But Gibson's journey with this story did not end at the cross. During his conversation with Rogan, he revealed that he and screenwriter Randall Wallace had spent 6 or 7 years developing a new project focused on the resurrection. And this would not be a typical sequel. Not a direct continuation. Not a familiar retelling of the empty tomb. Gibson described something far more ambitious. A story reaching from the fall of the angels to the death of the final apostle. A sweeping vision of good and evil, time and eternity, heaven and earth, all connected through the resurrection of Christ. That is an entirely different scale. Most films about Jesus concentrate on the visible world, the disciples, the Roman rulers, the tomb, the witnesses, the early church. Gibson wants to move beyond that. He wants to present the resurrection not simply as an ending, but as the central point of everything. The moment history shifts. The moment death loses its power. The moment the spiritual battle is fully revealed. For Gibson, the Gospels are not myths or moral tales. He sees them as testimony. History carried by men who suffered and died rather than deny what they believed they had witnessed. And that was one of the most compelling questions he placed before Rogan. Who dies for something they know is false? That question sits at the center of Gibson's worldview. The resurrection is the ultimate impossible claim. A man publicly executed, buried, and then alive again. It challenges the ordinary laws of nature. It forces the skeptic to confront something that cannot simply be dismissed as metaphor if the witnesses were speaking the truth. Gibson admitted that earlier in life, he accepted many of these beliefs because they had been handed down to him. But over time, faith became personal. He began exploring, studying, questioning, and trying to understand belief not as inheritance, but as reality. And that journey now influences his art. He is not trying to create religious content that merely comforts believers. He wants to challenge believers and skeptics alike with the questions most entertainment chooses to avoid. What is death? What is evil? What is sacrifice? What if the supernatural is not fiction? What if the most important event in human history truly happened? That is the territory he wants to explore next. And if the Passion of the Christ revealed the suffering, the Resurrection Project seems designed to reveal the meaning behind that suffering on a cosmic scale. Which brings us back to Rogan. Because the thing that appeared to affect him most was not one single detail. It was the entire picture. What everyone missed. So what was the hidden truth that shook Joe Rogan? It was not one secret. It was the weight of the whole story. The truth that Gibson had to stand almost alone to make a film the industry did not want. The truth that the production itself was marked by pain, danger, strange events, and personal transformation. The truth that a film made with conviction reached millions of people even after experts insisted there was no audience for it. The truth that faith, when taken seriously, is not always gentle. Sometimes it costs something. Sometimes it isolates you. Sometimes it makes you look unreasonable. Sometimes it forces you to risk your name, your money, your friendships, and your place in the world. That is what Gibson did. Whether people admire him or criticize him, whether they love the film or hate it, the fact remains that he made something without compromise. He refused to soften it. He refused to modernize it into safety. He refused to let the gatekeepers decide which sacred stories were acceptable and which ones had to stay buried. And that refusal is rare. In an age of calculation, brand management, and fear, sincerity can feel almost shocking. A person willing to lose everything for a story seems out of place. But that is why the film still matters. The Passion of the Christ forces viewers into contact with suffering, guilt, sacrifice, mercy, and redemption. It does not offer easy comfort. It does not smooth the edges. It does not let the viewer remain untouched. It asks hard questions. Questions about human cruelty. Questions about divine purpose. Questions about whether salvation could really require such a terrible price. Most entertainment avoids those questions. This film walks straight into them. More than 2 decades later, it remains divisive. Some still call it one of the most powerful works of spiritual cinema ever made. Others still believe it is deeply flawed or dangerous. Both reactions prove the same point. The film touched something too deep to be neutral. Great art does that. It unsettles. It provokes. It exposes what people believe beneath the surface. And the Gibson-Rogan conversation revealed something most celebrity interviews never reach. Behind the controversy was a human story. A director taking a risk. An actor enduring real pain. A cast and crew experiencing moments they could not easily explain. An audience encountering a story that demanded more than casual attention. That is what so many people missed. The Passion of the Christ was not just a movie. It was a man staking everything on a story the world told him not to tell. And somehow, against every warning, every rejection, every prediction of failure, that story reached the world anyway. The hidden truth is no longer hidden. It is there for anyone willing to look past the controversy. To listen past the noise. To ask why this film still has the power to disturb, move, divide, and transform people after all these years. Because some stories are not made simply to entertain. Some stories cost something real. Some stories demand a response. And some stories, once told, cannot be buried again.